Her voice cut through the stunned silence, sharp, urgent, dripping with accusation. "That's them. They're dangerous." She stood at the edge of the property, face lit by the strobing lights, finger stabbing the air toward the man in the tailored suit at the center of the crowd. Uniformed officers fanned out, their boots sinking into the grass. They moved between tables, scanning faces, their eyes darting from guest to guest. The smell of roasted lamb and sweet icing still lingered in the air, but it was swallowed by the metallic tang of tension. Some guests clutched their purses and phones. Others edged backward, whispering questions they were too afraid to say out loud. Music equipment still hummed softly on stage, but no one danced now. The only rhythm was the steady crunch of police footsteps. Then, a pause. One officer, mid-stride, looked straight at the groom. Recognition flickered across his face. His hand, which had been hovering near his radio, slowly fell to his side. His mouth opened just slightly, as though he wasn't sure whether to smile or apologize. And in that stillness, between the woman's pointed glare and the groom's calm, unflinching stare, it became clear. The night had just shifted in a way no one in that garden would forget. If you stand for respect and truth, hit the subscribe button now and share in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know. The estate gleamed under the afternoon sun, every tablecloth smoothed, every flower stem perfectly in place. Years of planning high-profile events in Atlanta had taught me that the smallest details could make the loudest statements. And for this wedding, every detail mattered. This wasn't just another ceremony. It was a celebration of love, culture, and community in a space that rarely welcomed any of those when they came wrapped in black skin. Planning events had been my life's work. I'd built a reputation for creating spaces where everyone felt they belonged, curating gatherings that mixed elegance with authenticity. Corporate galas, charity fundraisers, intimate family celebrations. I'd done them all. But when my oldest friend, Tasha, called and told me she was getting married, I didn't just agree to plan it. I claimed it like it was my own. Tasha had been my anchor since we were kids. We'd grown up in the same neighborhood, shared the same bus stop, traded dreams about the lives we'd build. She'd grown into the kind of woman who made her community better, organizing food drives, tutoring neighborhood kids, showing up for people whether or not they'd shown up for her. The man she chose to marry, Marcus, carried that same quiet strength. Marcus was the kind of leader who made people forget the title before his name. Humble in conversation, gracious in disagreement, and never one to pull rank, though rank, in his case, meant being the governor of the state. That fact still made people blink twice, especially those who expected power to come packaged in a certain skin tone. When we toured the estate together, a sprawling property tucked in a neighborhood where the houses carried generational wealth, I knew this was the place. The manicured lawns, the stone courtyard, the towering oaks. It felt like taking up space in a way that could not be ignored. But not everyone saw it that way. Mrs. Alderson, who lived across the street, had a smile that could frost glass. She wasn't overtly hostile, but her words always carried a thin edge. Over the months of planning, she'd made passing remarks about traffic congestion from delivery trucks, about noise during the rehearsal dinner. Never anything direct enough to call out, but always just enough to remind me that she didn't think we belonged. As I made my final rounds, checking the seating chart one last time, I caught her on her porch. She stood stiff, hands clasped, eyes tracking each guest who arrived. The gaze wasn't one of idle curiosity, it was an inventory. I told myself to focus on the celebration, to let her stare from her porch while inside the gates, joy would set the tone. But somewhere deep down, I felt it. The awareness that this day, in this place, was going to test more than my skills as an event planner. It was going to test the very idea of who was allowed to belong here. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you stand for respect over revenue, subscribe to Echoes of Hope. The more we share these stories, the fewer rooms there will be where silence is mistaken for agreement. The morning air carried that electric hum of preparation. Caterers unloading trays, photographers snapping test shots, and soft laughter from the bridal suite drifting across the garden. But beyond the white archway and rows of chairs, across the narrow street, there she was. Mrs. Alderson stood on her porch in a pressed blouse and slacks, one hand resting on the railing, the other pressed to her phone. Her gaze was fixed, unblinking, scanning the driveway where guests had begun to arrive. I couldn't hear her full conversation, but certain words floated over. Too many cars, all kinds of people. Don't know who they are. The tone wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion, wrapped in the politeness she wore like a winter coat. I turned back to the courtyard, checking the centerpieces, smoothing a linen napkin that didn't need smoothing. This was Tasha and Marcus's day, and I refused to let a porch-bound spectator inject her tension into it. Still, the signs kept coming. A young couple stepped out of their car, laughing, only to have their smiles fade as they noticed her watching. Another guest, an older man in a kente stole, caught my eye and gave a subtle shake of his head, as if to say, "We see her." Whispered conversations bubbled just under the music the DJ was testing. When the bakery van arrived with the cake, the driver rolled his dolly up to me and leaned in. "Hey, just so you know, that lady across the street, she stopped me when I was unloading, asked what kind of people were getting married here today. Kept asking if it was some kind of, political rally." His eyes darted toward her house. Weirdest drop-off I've ever done. I felt my jaw tighten. I thanked him, signed the delivery slip, and reminded myself to stay anchored. The temptation to march across the street and confront her was strong, but that wasn't my role today. My role was to guard the joy inside these gates. But as the morning turned to midday and more guests filled the courtyard, her presence never wavered. Every car door that opened seemed to pull her attention sharper. Every hug between friends, every bright patterned dress, every handshake, she absorbed it all like evidence. I kept moving, adjusting a floral arrangement here, handing out programs there, all while feeling the weight of her watchful eyes. Because this wasn't about traffic or parking. It wasn't about noise. It was about seeing a crowd of black guests in her neighborhood and deciding that was reason enough to call it into question. And as the ceremony hour crept closer, I realized this wasn't just going to be an undercurrent. This was a fuse. And sure enough, by the time the first notes of the processional played, that fuse had already started to burn, carrying us straight into the heart of the wedding itself. The courtyard glowed with late afternoon light as the ceremony began. Every chair filled, every face turned toward the archway, draped in white roses and soft greenery. The air pulsed with the warm rhythms of the drummers at the entrance, their hands moving in patterns that echoed centuries of tradition. The bride stepped forward in a gown that flowed like water, her veil pinned with delicate gold accents. Gasps rose from the guests, not for the spectacle, but for the undeniable beauty of a moment that was fully, unapologetically ours. The officiant's voice carried with a steady calm as he welcomed everyone. Call and response filled the space, blending the familiar cadence of church with the polished tone of an official ceremony. Each vow was laced with the couple's story, how they'd met, the obstacles they'd faced, the joy they'd chosen. Guests laughed at Marcus's playful teasing, dabbed at their eyes during Tasha's quiet declaration that home has always been wherever you are. Even as I absorbed the magic of it, my eyes kept drifting past the gate. Across the street, Mrs. Alderson still stood on her porch, arms folded now, no phone in sight, just watching. Her posture was sharp, like she was waiting for something she'd already decided was coming. Halfway through the vows, the low hum of an engine drew my attention. An unmarked sedan rolled slowly past the estate, windows tinted dark. It didn't speed up or slow down, just glided by as though taking inventory. A few heads turned to follow it, brows furrowed, but the ceremony carried on. I stepped aside to let the photographers capture the ring exchange, and that's when I felt a gentle tug at my elbow. Marcus's Aunt Loretta, her hair wrapped in deep blue fabric, leaned close and whispered, "Baby, something don't feel right." Her voice wasn't panicked, but it was certain. The kind of certainty you don't question when it comes from someone who's lived long enough to recognize the shape of trouble before it arrives. I squeezed her hand, forcing a smile I wasn't sure reached my eyes, and told her we'd talk after the ceremony. The guests rose for the final blessing. The drummers played a triumphant rhythm, and Tasha and Marcus walked back down the aisle hand in hand, the crowd erupting in applause. For a moment it felt like nothing could touch this joy. But just beyond the archway, past the music and the clapping, I caught sight of Mrs. Alderson stepping off her porch again. And this time, she had her phone back in her hand. And it would be during the reception, as laughter filled the air and plates clinked, that her calls would turn into something far more visible and far more dangerous. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you stand for respect over revenue, subscribe to Echoes of Hope. The more we share these stories, the fewer rooms there will be where silence is mistaken for agreement. The courtyard had transformed into a scene of pure celebration. Music spilled from the speakers, blending Afrobeats with smooth jazz. Guests lined up at the buffet, where jerk chicken, herb-roasted lamb, collard greens, and plantains sent waves of warm, rich aroma through the air. Glasses clinked as toasts began at the smaller tables. Children twirled in their dress shoes on the dance floor, their laughter riding the rhythm of the drums. I moved through the space, checking that plates were full and the DJ's setlist stayed on track. But beyond the laughter and music, movement across the street caught my eye. There was Mrs. Alderson again, phone pressed tight to her ear, pacing the length of her porch. Her free hand gestured sharply, as if she were giving directions or describing something urgent. Every so often, she'd pause, glance toward the gate, and resume her back and forth. I told myself to focus on the joy here, not the agitation there. Still, the knot in my stomach tightened. 15 minutes later, the sound of sirens sliced through the music. At first, it was faint, enough to make a few people glance toward the road, but not enough to stop the party. Then they grew louder. Squad cars rolled into view, lights flashing. Behind them came two unmarked SUVs, their windows just as dark as the sedan I'd seen earlier. And then, as if this wasn't already surreal, another black vehicle pulled up, its antenna swaying slightly with the motion. The kind federal agencies use when they mean business. The music faltered, replaced by murmurs. Conversations stalled. A few guests instinctively pulled out their phones, recording as the line of vehicles stopped outside the gate. Uniformed officers stepped out, followed by plainclothes agents. Their eyes swept the crowd, scanning faces, noting movements. And then, from the property's edge, a voice cut through the confusion. "That's him. He's wanted." All heads turned toward Mrs. Alderson. She stood near the gate now, pointing directly at Marcus. Her voice was sharp, ringing with a conviction that made some guests freeze in place. The accusation was naked, loud enough for every child, every elder, every guest to hear. A ripple of unease moved through the courtyard. Some guests instinctively stepped back, others moved closer to Marcus. He stood still, his expression calm but unreadable, one hand resting on the back of a chair. Tasha's hand tightened around his arm. The officers didn't rush forward, but the air was suddenly heavy, charged with the weight of every time a black man has been misjudged in an instant. And it was in that moment, with her voice still echoing and the officers closing in, that the confrontation began, one that would decide whether this day ended in celebration or in chaos. The officers moved in like a tide, spreading out between tables, their eyes sweeping the faces of family, friends, elders, and children alike. They started asking for IDs, voices clipped but not loud. Yet the weight of their presence turned every request into a command. Guests fumbled for wallets and purses, some moving stiffly, others whispering questions under their breath. The music had long stopped. The only sounds were the shuffle of feet on grass and the crackle of radios. I could feel my chest tighten as I watched Tasha's grandmother hand over her driver's license with trembling fingers. Across the lawn, a groomsman stood tall but stiff, while an agent scanned his ID as if expecting it to dissolve into something incriminating. A teenage cousin, no older than 16, tried to joke his way through it, but stopped when the officer didn't smile back. In the center of it all, Marcus stood with the same calm I'd seen him use to settle heated community meetings. His posture was steady, his tone respectful, his words deliberate. "Gentlemen, you're welcome to confirm anything you need," he said, nodding toward his pocket. "My ID is right here." The agents glanced at each other, one of them already looking faintly uneasy. His brow furrowed as he scanned Marcus's features, recognition dawning but not yet voiced. Before that recognition could settle, Mrs. Alderson's voice cut in again from just outside the gate, louder than before. "That's a gang front. Check his record. He's dangerous. Her eyes were locked on Marcus, her fingers still pointed like she was marking a suspect in a lineup. It wasn't just an accusation. It was the culmination of every assumption she'd ever allowed herself to believe about black men, dressed in the language of civic duty. My stomach turned. In that moment, I saw every stereotype she'd ever believed about us spill out in broad daylight, poured onto a man whose life's work was public service. The agent who'd been studying Marcus straightened. His voice was low, but it carried in the sudden quiet. "I think I know who this is." The others turned toward him, waiting for confirmation. The tension shifted, just slightly, enough to make Mrs. Alderson falter for the first time. And it was in that fragile pause, the moment before truth could cut through the noise, that the reveal began, setting the stage for a reaction none of us could have predicted. The agent who had been studying Marcus stepped forward, his expression shifting from wary to almost stunned. For a brief second, the air seemed to hold still. No movement, no sound beyond the faint hiss of a nearby champagne bottle losing its fizz. He stopped directly in front of Marcus, looked him straight in the eye, and extended his hand. "Governor," he said, voice steady but tinged with regret, "I'm so sorry." The word hung there, "Governor," slicing through the tension like a blade. It didn't need repeating. Those close enough to hear it reacted first. A sharp intake of breath from the bridal party, a low gasp from the DJ, the sudden click of a phone camera as someone captured the moment. Marcus took the agent's hand without a flicker of arrogance. "It's all right," he replied quietly, though I could tell from the set of his jaw that it wasn't all right at all. The agent gave a nod, signaling to the others. Immediately, the questioning stopped. Officers lowered their radios, a few stepping back, faces flushing. Across the courtyard, Mrs. Alderson's face drained of color. She didn't move, didn't speak. The arm that had been raised in accusation only minutes ago now hung awkwardly at her side. Her eyes darted between Marcus and the officers, searching for an explanation that wouldn't come. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind across tall grass. "Governor?" someone said under their breath. "She called the cops on the governor?" Another voice, incredulous. "Does she have any idea who she's talking about?" Phones were up everywhere now, recording her stunned expression, capturing the scene from every angle. I could already see the captions forming in my head. "Neighbor calls FBI on black groom. Finds out he's the governor." It was surreal, almost disorienting, to watch the narrative she'd built, dangerous stranger, gang front, threat, crumble in an instant. The man she'd tried to have marched out of his own wedding was the highest elected official in the state, a man entrusted with signing laws, managing budgets, and representing millions of citizens, including her. The agent, still standing beside Marcus, glanced toward Mrs. Alderson, his expression hardening. If there was any apology for her, it wasn't coming from him. The truth had been laid bare, and it didn't flatter her. Marcus placed a steady hand on Tasha's back, guiding her toward the head table with a calm that made the reversal even sharper. The guests followed their lead, returning to their seats, though the energy had shifted completely. This wasn't just a wedding anymore. It had become a public moment of reckoning. And as the music hesitantly returned and the plates of food reappeared, the aftermath began to unfold. One that would reach far beyond this garden by the next morning. Marcus stepped up to the microphone near the bandstand, his presence enough to quiet the chatter without a single raised hand. He glanced around the courtyard, letting his eyes meet those of friends, family, and even the officers still lingering near the gate. "Well," he began with a small chuckle, "I've had my fair share of uninvited guests at public events, but I've got to admit, this one takes the cake." Laughter rolled through the crowd, easing shoulders that had been tense moments earlier. Even the DJ cracked a smile, relief softening the air. Marcus waited for the chuckles to settle, then shifted his tone. "Jokes aside, today is supposed to be about love, about unity, yet we were reminded how quickly assumptions can strip those things away. This isn't just about me or Tasha or any one person here. It's about the truth that dignity shouldn't have to be proven, and respect shouldn't be conditional." His words landed heavy, met with quiet nods and murmurs of agreement. As he stepped down, the applause was more than polite. It was the kind that comes from people who have seen a moment of injustice turned on its head. Guests began moving back toward the buffet, laughter and conversations slowly rising again. Meanwhile, near the gate, Mrs. Alderson had begun inching toward the sidewalk, clutching her purse as though it might shield her from the eyes on her. She kept her gaze down, perhaps hoping to slip away unnoticed. But she hadn't accounted for the cluster of reporters now gathered just beyond the property line, alerted by the live streams guests had been broadcasting all afternoon. The moment she stepped outside the gate, microphones and cameras swung toward her. Questions fired in rapid succession. Why did you call the police? Were you aware the groom was the governor? Do you regret your actions? She raised a hand, muttered, no comment, and quickened her pace down the street. But the cameras followed until she disappeared around the corner. I watched from the edge of the courtyard, my phone buzzing in my hand. Notifications were piling up, friends texting, social media tags multiplying. By the time the last song of the evening played, the headline had already made its way onto national feeds. Black governor accused at his own wedding. Neighbor sparks outrage. It hadn't even been 3 hours since the sirens arrived, yet the story was already out of our control, carried into living rooms and newsrooms across the country. And as I stood there, scrolling through the flood of reactions, I knew the next chapter would be about more than a wedding. It would be about the community, the media, and the backlash that was only just beginning. By the next morning, the story had taken on a life of its own. Every major network was looping the same 30-second clip, Mrs. Alderson's voice cutting through the air. That's him, he's wanted, followed by the unmistakable handshake between Marcus and the federal agent. The contrast was almost cinematic, and it played on repeat across news sites, talk shows, and social media feeds. On one channel, a panel of commentators dissected the incident frame by frame, highlighting how quickly the officers' demeanor changed once they realized who Marcus was. Another segment replayed the live stream from a guest's phone, raw and unedited, complete with the gasps and whispered disbelief of the crowd. Civil rights groups moved quickly. Statements poured in from organizations condemning the racial profiling and calling for stronger accountability measures. Some leaders drew direct parallels to other high-profile cases where black men and women had been publicly humiliated based on nothing but assumption. Hashtags sprang up overnight, and within hours, Marcus's name was trending alongside phrases like, "Respect is a right," and "at my own wedding." Back in the neighborhood, the reaction was split. A handful of residents doubled down, defending Mrs. Alderson in interviews. She was just looking out for the community, one man insisted to a local reporter. Another claimed she had every right to be suspicious, given the number of cars and people she didn't recognize. But their voices were drowned out by those who felt embarrassed, even angry, that this had happened in their community. "I'm ashamed," one longtime neighbor admitted on camera. "We all know what this was about, and it's not the first time people here have been made to feel they don't belong." Others left flowers and handwritten notes at the gate of the estate, apologizing to Marcus and Tasha for the ordeal. For me, watching it all unfold felt like standing in the middle of two storms, one fueled by the speed of lies, the other by the momentum of truth. I kept thinking about how quickly Mrs. Alderson's accusation had traveled across that lawn, how instantly it had shifted the mood. And yet the truth, once spoken, once seen, had spread faster, wider, and louder than she could have imagined. It was proof of something I'd always known but rarely got to witness so clearly. That while prejudice can be shouted, dignity can echo louder if you let it. And as the media firestorm swelled, I realized the next part of the story wouldn't be told by reporters or neighbors. It would come from Marcus himself, in a moment of quiet reflection that carried more weight than all the headlines combined. I'll be honest, there was a point, right after I saw Mrs. Alderson pacing with that phone in her hand, when the thought crossed my mind, maybe we should call it off. Not forever, just postpone. Let the dust settle, move the celebration somewhere else, somewhere we wouldn't have to brace ourselves for trouble before the cake was even cut. But I didn't say it, because deep down, I knew doing that would send a message, and not the kind I wanted the children at this wedding to take home. If we moved, if we bowed to the tension, It would mean the unspoken rules still worked. Rules about where black joy is appropriate, where it's allowed to take up space without being challenged. Standing my ground wasn't just about protecting a wedding. It was about refusing to shrink in a place where we belonged as much as anyone else. I thought about the children. The flower girl in her yellow tulle dress, still clutching her basket long after the ceremony. The little boy in suspenders who tried to teach the best man a dance move halfway through dinner. They'd seen the sirens, the officers, the pointing finger. They'd seen adults stay calm in the face of it. Not because it wasn't serious, but because letting anger lead would have given the moment to the wrong person. One day, they'd talk about this, maybe to classmates, maybe to their own kids. They'd remember the discomfort, yes, but also the way Marcus smiled when he took the microphone again, the way the crowd stood a little taller afterward. They'd remember that truth didn't just quietly survive the lie, it outshined it. It's easy to think of weddings as fragile things, as events that need protection from anything that might stain the day. But this one gained something. It became a living example of dignity under fire, of standing in the middle of someone's false story and refusing to play the part they've written for you. And for me, it became proof that sometimes the only way to claim your place is to stay exactly where you are, no matter how uncomfortable it gets. And that understanding set the tone for the final moments of the evening. A closing that would tie the whole day together, leaving everyone with more than just memories of a wedding, but a call to action they'd carry home. She wanted to make this day about shame. We made it about resilience. That's what I kept thinking as the last song faded and the guests lingered, reluctant to let the night end. The lawn, once tense with suspicion, now carried the sound of easy laughter, clinking glasses, and the shuffling of chairs being stacked for the morning. Marcus and Tasha stood near the gate, greeting each person as they left. No bitterness, no raised voices, just the quiet power of two people who had refused to let prejudice dictate the narrative of their own wedding. They posed for photos, accepted hugs, and thanked people for coming, as if the day had gone exactly as planned. That kind of grace under pressure isn't taught, it's lived. Watching them, I felt the weight of what had happened settle into something more permanent. This wasn't just an interruption. It was a test, and they'd passed it with a kind of dignity that left the accuser small and forgettable. The guests would go home with more than memories of good food and dancing. They'd remember the sirens, yes, but they'd also remember the reversal, the way truth stood taller than assumption. They'd remember that even in a place where you're made to feel like an outsider, you can claim your space without losing yourself in the fight. And that's what I want you, watching this now, to take away. If you've ever been targeted for who you are, not for what you've done, tell your story in the comments. Let's make sure their lies never stand unchallenged. Your voice matters, and it deserves to be heard. Subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ for more real stories of courage and justice, stories that remind us that silence isn't neutrality, it's surrender. We don't surrender here, because in the end, it wasn't Mrs. Alderson's voice people remembered. It wasn't her accusation that made the headlines. It was the moment she realized her story had been replaced by a truth too strong to be ignored. And that's the thing about resilience. Once it's seen, it can't be unseen.